Tensing the Copula by David Lewis. A solution to the problem of intrinsic change for enduring things should meet three conditions. It should not replace monadic intrinsic properties by relations. It should not replace the having simpliciter of properties by standing in some relation to them, unless having them simpliciter always means standing in some relation to them, which is refuted by Bradley's regress. It should not rely on an unexplained notion of having an intrinsic property at a time. Johnston's solution satisfies the first condition at the expense of the second. Haslanger's solution satisfies the first and second at the expense of the third. 1. The problem about persistence. The problem about persistence is the problem of change insofar as it pertains to intrinsic properties. Things somehow persist through time. When they do, they have some of their intrinsic properties temporarily. For instance, shape. Sometimes you sit, and then you are bent. Sometimes you stand or lie, and then you are straight. How can one and the same thing have two contrary intrinsic properties? How does it help that it has them at different times? Three solutions are on offer. I favor the hypothesis of perdurance. It says that persisting things are sums of temporal parts. Their temporary intrinsic properties belong in the first instance to their temporal parts. It is no problem that two different temporal parts can differ in their intrinsic properties. A persisting thing is like a parade. First one part of it shows up, and then another, except that most persisting things are much more continuous than most parades. The only trouble with this hypothesis is that very many philosophers reject it as counterintuitive, or revisionist, or downright crazy, except in the case of events or processes. It is a mystery why. Unfortunately, those who try to explain why they reject the hypothesis merely restate it. They say, perhaps, that it likens a persisting thing to a parade, apart from the extent of the discontinuities. Or they say that its full craziness comes out because it implies that if I have had exactly one bit of chalk in my hand for the last hour, then there is something in my hand, which is chalk, which was not in my hand 3 minutes ago, namely, a temporal part of the chalk beginning less than 3 minutes ago. All we learn is that they reject the hypothesis because it says what it does. We are none the wiser. The hypothesis of presentism treats the modifiers in the past and in the future like a counterfeit in counterfeit money. These modifiers often attach to falsehoods to make truths. What exists only in the past or in the future is something that exists and is located in the past or in the future. It is something that does not exist at all. Likewise, what has an intrinsic property only in the past or the future does not have that property. These modifiers cannot be explained in terms of a domain including wholly past or future things, because there is no such domain. A so-called persisting thing, if it really exists, is located entirely in the present. When the presentist obligingly agrees that it exists in the past and in the future, he is not saying that it or any part of it is located elsewhere in time. He is attaching his modifiers to alleged falsehoods to make truths. Thus, he denies what others mean when they say that things persist and undergo intrinsic change. Of course, the presentist has no problem of intrinsic change, but he escapes it at far too high a cost. The hypothesis of endurance is far and away the most popular. It deserves a run for its money, at least on that account. Things have no temporal parts. Rather, a persisting thing is multiply located in time. The whole of it is at one time and also at another. Yet the same identical thing may have different intrinsic properties at different times at which it is located. You are bent at time t1, straight at time t2, but it is the whole of you, not one or another of your alleged temporal parts, that is bent and that is straight. How can that be? Endurance calls to mind two things. One is the power of spatial bilocation traditionally ascribed to saints. If a bilocated saint is holy in Rome and holy in Byzantium, and if in Rome he is bent and in Byzantium he is straight, then we have a problem of local intrinsics that exactly parallels the problem of temporary intrinsics for an enduring thing, except that philosophers have been much less eager to solve it. The other is the multiple location in both space and time that is ascribed to immanent universals, if such there be. But unless we can come up with an example of an intrinsic property that a universal has at one of its locations and not at another, and I know of none, we have no problem of temporary or local intrinsics for universals. 2. Intrinsic properties as relations to times. There is an obvious solution to the problem of temporary intrinsics for an enduring thing. Its so-called temporary intrinsic properties are not really monadic properties, but rather dyadic relations to times. If you are bent at t1 and straight at t2, you bear the bent at relation to t1 and the straight at relation to t2. There is no problem about how the same thing can bear contrary relations to two different relata. If we insist on genuine monadic properties of the enduring thing, we can have those as well. They will be relational properties, bearing bent at 2t1, bearing straight at 2t2. Relational is a classification that applies to structured properties, properties taken to have a quasi-syntactic structure whereby they are constructed from their constituents. The relational property just considered has a dyadic relation as one of its constituents, and a suitable relatum at another. Note that structured properties are hyper-intentionally individuated. Two of them, constructed from different constituents, or from the same constituents in a different way, are different even if they are necessarily coextensive. Note that a relational property is not the same thing as an intrinsic property, or extrinsic property. Extrinsic is an intentional classification that applies to structured and unstructured properties alike. Suppose Platonism is true, and the forms are necessary beings which cannot be said to accompany things in the world. Then bearing imitation to the form of squareness is a relational property, but it is also intrinsic. It cannot differ between duplicates, and whether something has it or lacks, it is independent of whether that thing is accompanied or unaccompanied, and it is neither a disjunctive property nor the negation of one. I cannot object to these relations and relational properties, not, at least, if they are alleged to be fundamental properties of the sort that might figure in a minimal basis on which all else supervenes. I accept similar relations and relational properties myself. You bear bent at to the times at which you have bent temporal parts, and if t1 is one of those times, you have bearing bent at to t1. But I do object to leaving the monadic intrinsic properties out of the picture. So intrinsic properties really are monadic. For instance, the property of living 80 years and 10. Even the properties bent and straight could at least sometimes be monadic. For instance, when they are properties of momentary things. There is no reason in that case to take them as relations to times. So I want to know, where have the monadic properties bent and straight gone? What have they to do with our newfound bent at and straight at relations and our newfound relational properties constructed from these relations? Under the endurance hypothesis, there is nothing left in a case of temporary bentness and straightness to have bent or straight. Or anyway, nothing is left to have them simpliciter, without benefit of some sort of modifier that attaches to falsehoods to make truths. Not the temporal parts, they do not exist. Not the enduring thing, it does not have them, it only modifiedly has them by having them at t1 or at t2. Some will insist that certain relations to times are just what we call intrinsic properties. So it is senseless to hanker that really intrinsic properties in addition. Hanker after really intrinsic properties in addition. If they are willing to accept the consequence that the so-called intrinsic properties are a divided category, we've reached a stalemate. But there are others, among them Mark Johnston, who agree that it will not do to have the monadic intrinsic properties bent and straight out of the picture. We need a way to bring them back in without giving up endurance hypothesis. 3. Bringing back the intrinsic properties. Johnston's solution is to tense the copula. Instantiating a property, it turns out, is instantiating at some time the property. It is not the intrinsic property, bent or straight, but rather the copula that relates this property to a thing that has it, that turns into a relation to times. Having was originally thought to be a dyadic relation to things to properties. Now it will instead be a triadic relation of things to properties and times. If you have at t the property bent is unscathed. It is still the old monadic intrinsic property we always thought it was. It is not replaced either by a relation or by a relational property. I protest that there is still nothing in the picture that has bent or straight simpliciter. Not you, not your non-existent temporal parts. Instead of having bent simpliciter, you bear the having at relation to it at t1. But it is one thing to have a property. It is something else to bear some relation to it. If a relation stands between you and your properties, you are alienated from them. All you have simpliciter is a relational property, bearing having at 2 bent and T1. The property bent must enter into this relational property as a constituent, else there is no connection left between bent and the property you have simpliciter. In order to say so, we must again assume that we are dealing here with a structured property. Tu quoque. Don't I also deny that your perduring self has simpliciter the property bent? Don't I also say that it bears to this property the having at T1 relation, where this is the relation that a perduring thing bears to a property just in case it contains a temporal part that is located at T1 and has that property? If bearing a relation to a property rather than having it simpliciter alienates you from that property, isn't this equally a problem for perdurance? I think not. There's more to say. To be sure, your perduring self does not have bent simpliciter, but as much of you exists at T1 does. In talking about what is true at a certain time, we can, and we very often do, restrict our domain of discourse so as to ignore everything located elsewhere in time. Restricting the domain in this way, your temporal part at D1 is deemed to be the whole of you. So there is a good sense in which you do, after all, have bent simpliciter. The protagonist of endurance cannot say the same. An effective rejoinder to my protest, if it were true, would be to claim that all having of properties is relational, whether a thing has a property P simpliciter that is to be explained by saying that the thing bears a relation to having 2P, or equivalently, that it has the relational property bearing having 2P. If that is enough to alienate us from our properties, we are always alienated from our properties. My protest proves too much to deserve belief. If all having is relational, but not on that account alienating, why is relational having at a time any worse? 4. That way lies Bradley's regress. I would be willing enough to believe in a having relation that something bears to a property, or in a triadic having relation that an enduring thing, if such there be, bears to a property and a time, or in a relational property of, say, bearing having to bent and T, assuming once again that these are not alleged to be fundamental relations and properties. But I do not think these relations can explain having simpliciter. Having simpliciter is not a relation, whatever grammar may suggest. What is it then? I don't know what more can be said. It is all very well to say that the copula is a non-relational tie, or that properties are unsaturated and await completion by their bearers. These remarks at least have the merit of pointing away from the idea that having is relational, but they don't point toward much of anything. Bradley's regress shows that if we insist on having to explain having simpliciter in terms of relational having, the explanation we seek will never be finished. Run through it first in terms of relational properties. Keep it simple by ignoring time. Let P be a permanent property of X. X has P by having bearing having 2P, by having bearing to having 2 bearing having to P, by having bearing having 2 bearing having 2 bearing having 2P by, and so ad infinitum. No sooner have we explained one having relationally than another one appears, needing its own relational explanation in turn. If we would rather bypass the relational properties, we can instead resort to a sequence of having relations of ever greater polyidacity. Signify an n-adic relation by a superscript n. X has P by having P by having 3, having 2, having 1 P by having 4, having 3, having 2, having 1 P by, and so ad infinitum. Again, our explanation can never be finished. No harm is done, so long as we say that these havings by havings are not meant to be explanations, only equivalences. In that case, we can stop the regress anywhere we like, and claim that our most recently mentioned having is not a relational having, but rather a having simpliciter. But then we have given up on explaining having simpliciter in terms of relational having, so we have given up on showing that all having is relational. So we've given up on showing that relational having at T1 is no more alienating than any other having. At this point, it is tempting to say that having a property at a time is a sort of hybrid. So far as the property goes, it is a non-relational tie. So far as time goes, it is a relation. But this is whistling in the dark. We have no developed idea of what sort of thing a non-relational tie might be. Still less have we any idea what a hybrid of a non-relational tie and a relation might be. I said earlier that having a simpliciter a non-relational tie pointed away from error but not toward much of anything, and I have just said that we have no developed idea of what a non-relational tie might be. Should we remedy that? We might reify non-relational ties and say something about them. As follows: a dyadic tie is an entity that ties a thing to a property, and for the most part is contingent, which things are tied to which properties. A triadic tie ties two relata to a dyadic relation, and again it is for the most part contingent on what is tied to what. A tetradic tie, by now it is all too obvious that ties are relations in all but name. Relations in all but name will serve us no better than relations openly so called. We can repeat Bradley's regress in both its versions to show that we can never finish an attempted explanation of having simpliciter in terms of ties, and ties will alienate us from our properties no less than relations do. I conclude that reifying non-relational ties and giving an account of them is a thoroughly misguided thing to do. 5. An ad hominem rejoinder. Someone might say to me, "You're a fine fellow to tell us that having simpliciter is non-relational. You think that a property is the class of its instances, all the instances, those in this world, those in other worlds, even those, if any, that are in no world, or that are not entirely in any one world. You leave it open whether some few elite properties correspond to immanent universals. But even if they do, you still think there's a property as class as well, the universal. You think that to have the property is to be a member of the class. So for you, the relation of having is the membership relation." Up to the final sentence, that is right. But the final sentence, which is crucial to the ad hominem point, goes wrong, because I do not believe in the membership relation. A preliminary point which does not get us very far. I do not believe in a relation which holds between member and class in all cases of membership. Proof. Case 1. There are no proper classes. Then the membership relation would have to be set of all ordered pairs of member and set. But we can show by the set theoretic axioms of replacement, unions, and Ausonderung that if there were any such set, there would be a set of all non-self-membered sets, which leads to contradiction. Case 2. There are proper classes. Then some of the ordered pairs of member and class must themselves be taken as proper classes. The usual constructions of ordered pairs don't work when the second term of the pair is a proper class, but one that does work is to take the Cartesian product of the singleton of the first term with the second term. Then the membership relation would have to be a class with proper classes as members, which is impossible. QED. Our objector is unappeased. You do not believe in a restricted membership relation for the special case of set membership. This relation is a proper class, but you don't object to those. Right, I don't. Mundane properties will be seats, not proper classes. For instance, the property purple will be the set of all purple possibilia. So, for these mundane properties at least, you explain having simpliciter in terms of the set membership relation. But I'm not so sure that mundane properties won't be proper classes. I thought so once, but now Nolan has made a fairly persuasive case that there are more possibilia than I used to think. In fact, proper class many. If so, there may well be proper class many members of the property purple. There is another reason why I do not believe in the membership relation, not even if it is the restricted set membership relation. I am inclined to favor set theoretical structuralism. According to structuralism, we can say, roughly, that there are many set theoretical hierarchies. Each one has its own set membership relation. There is no such thing as the one set membership relation that is common to them all. Compare arithmetical structuralism. There is There are no such things as the number sequence, the number 17, or the successor relation. There are many omega sequences, each with its own 17, its own successor relation. When we say, for instance, that 17 is prime, we are quantifying over omega sequences. For each omega sequence, its 17 cannot be obtained by multiplying its multiplication operation to any two of its numbers unless they are it's 17 and it's 1. An arithmetical structuralist who is not also a set theoretical structuralist can assume that he is given a fixed set theoretical hierarchy, within which he can construct his many omega sequences. A half-hearted set theoretical structuralist would likewise assume that he is given the one true and original set theoretical hierarchy, within which he can construct his many lesser set theoretical hierarchies. A whole-hearted set theoretical structuralist, which is what I want to be, can assume no such thing. He needs a way to quantify over hierarchies without assuming that they are constructions within the one true and original hierarchy. It helps to notice that a set theoretical hierarchy is generated from its member-singleton relation in much the same way that an omega sequence is generated from its successor relation. Our problem reduces to quantifying over relations that satisfy certain axioms. But how can we do that if we are not given a true and original hierarchy? What are we given, in my view? What we are given, in my view, is megathology, also known as monadic second-order mereology. These second-order quantifiers are understood, following Boulos, as plural quantifiers. Within this framework, we have no way to quantify over candidate member-singleton relations. But what we can do, using ingenious codings devised by John P. Burgess and Alan Hazen, is to simulate such quantification. Wholehearted structuralism turns out to be feasible after all. The upshot is that we can simulate quantification over hierarchies, and just as every omega sequence has its own 17, so likewise every hierarchy has its own class of purple things. In other words, its own property purple, though these properties understood as classes are not the same from one hierarchy to another. Within any one hierarchy, we can quantify over classes. So we can simulate quantification over properties by embedding a genuine quantifier over classes within a simulated quantifier over hierarchies. Further, it turns out that something is a member of a given hierarchy's property purple just in case it is one of the purple things. Our objector feels his patience sorely tired. So the long and short of it, and I would have much preferred the short, is that you explain the having simpliciter of properties not in terms of the relation of member to class, but rather in terms of the relation of member to plurality. Well, call it what you like, it sounds like a class to me. Your having simpliciter is relational after all. Well, if there were pluralities, they would sound like classes to me too, and I would prefer to call them that. What is worse, since we took plural quantification to be part of the given framework, they would have to be classes in the sense of the one true and original hierarchy, which is just what a wholehearted structuralist does not want. But I do not agree that we have any such things as pluralities, so I do not agree that we have any such thing as a relation of member to plurality. What we do have is a singular to plural copula, is one of, as in this is one of those. Given some entities of any kind whatever, we can say with every semblance of intelligibility and no known thread of paradox that something is one of them. We are not required to interpret the singular to plural copula relationally, and doing so leads to trouble. Suppose the relational interpretation is right, that we have a relation of membership in pluralities. Some things are not pluralities, so some things are non-self members. For instance, Kevin Sheedy is one of the non-self members. The relational interpretation says that this has to mean that we have a plurality of non-self members, and Sheedy is a member of it. Now we can ask whether this alleged plurality itself is one of the non-self members. The relational interpretation says that it is one of the non-self members just in case it is a member of itself. In short, if the singular to plural copula has to mean that something is a member of plurality, we fall into Russell's paradox for pluralities. So it had better not mean that. Instead, we should take it as a non-relational tie, understood as unreified. So the long and short of it is that, for me, having properties simpliciter is not relational. 6. Which copula do we tense? Suppose we have given up on explaining having simpliciter as relational, and suppose we have resisted any temptation to explain it in terms of reified non-relational ties. Now we can take Bradley's regress as many steps as we like and then get off, saying that at last we have reached non-relational having simpliciter. But that means we have a choice about which of the relational things is to be turned into a relation to times. There are infinitely many alternatives, depending on how many steps we take before we get off, and depending on which of the nested copulas we tense. Let's again take the version of the regress formulated in terms of relational properties with bent as a constituent. If your enduring self is bent at T1, which is the relational property that you have simpliciter, is it bearing having at 2 bent and T1? Bearing having at 2 bearing having 2 bent and T1. Bearing having 2 bearing having at 2 bent and T1. Bearing having at 2 bearing having 2 bearing having 2 bent and T1. Bearing having 2 bearing having at 2 bearing having 2 bent and T1. Bearing having 2 bearing having 2 bearing having at 2 bent and T1, all in different parentheses. If, contrary to what I have argued, the first of these is a satisfactory solution to the problem of temporary intrinsics for enduring things, so are all the rest. There is no way to choose between them. The tensor of copulas confronts an embarrassment of riches. Possibly the best response is to say that all the listed properties are had simpliciter, and since they are necessarily coextensive, there is no need to decide which one is the correct analysis of being bent at T1. 7. Another way to bring back the intrinsic properties. Sally Haslinger wants to defend the endurance hypothesis against the problem of temporary intrinsics. She agrees that it will not do to replace the monadic intrinsic properties by relations to times. We need to put the monadic intrinsic properties themselves back into the picture. But she also agrees that it will not do to put them in just as relata to some relation. Rather, they need to be the objects of having simpliciter. To explain how you can be bent at T1, not only do we need to mention the monadic intrinsic property bent, we also need to mention the proposition that you have this property simpliciter, and we need to say of this proposition that it obtains at T1. By proposition, Haslinger here means something that can obtain at some times and not at others, rather than something that is true or false once and for all. What is a proposition that obtains at some times and not others? It seems to behave exactly like a property of times, so let us take it to be just that. It obtains at just those times that have it. If so, the proposition Haslinger mentions is the relational property being a time t such that you have bent at t. What is this property? It must be a structured property with bent as a constituent. If you were an unstructured property, or if it had the bent at relation as a constituent, in place of the monadic intrinsic property bent, we would not have succeeded in bringing bent back into the picture. Further, it must not have the having at relation as a constituent, since it is supposed to be identical to the tensed proposition that you have bent simpliciter, not to the tensed proposition that you stand in some sort of relation to bent. But now, something unfortunate has happened. Within the anatomy of the tensed proposition that obtains at just those times when you are bent, in other words, the relational property just considered, we find that we have reintroduced without explanation the very thing we were trying to explain, the notion of an enduring thing having a monadic intrinsic property at a time. I conclude that the proposal fails.